Hey guys, tonight we're slipping barefoot through the dew-wet grass of a forest that hasn't heard a car horn in 3,000 years. You duck beneath low-hanging sal branches, the air thick with jasmine and smoke from a sacred fire, and somewhere through the foggy hymn of chanting Brahmins, you hear the unmistakable sound of a quill scratching against palm leaf parchment. No, it's not a tax ledger. It's a guide to oral techniques, written by a monk on a Tuesday. Welcome to ancient India, where the line between sacred and sultry wasn't just thin, it was a flirtatious suggestion. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and local time in the comments. I want to know who else is time traveling with us tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're now seated cross-legged outside a thatched hermitage. The guru inside wears nothing but a saffron wrap, and he's deep in a trance, lips murmuring verses of the Rigveda. But on the floor beside him, unrolled and annotated, is a manuscript so detailed on sensual touch, you wonder if it came with illustrations. Here, chastity didn't cancel curiosity, it cohabited with it. The ashrams of ancient India weren't your silent monastic prisons. They were cerebral salons where spiritual seekers, scholars, and royal guests debated dharma in the morning and composed erotic poetry by twilight. Sensuality wasn't a distraction, it was a mirror held up to the cosmos. The body, after all, was just another scripture to read. You begin to notice that these scribes, men and women alike, weren't just intellectuals. They were sensual philosophers. Mapping the human form like it was a metaphysical riddle. Their quills dipped in soot ink. They wrote about kiss types, eye gestures, and emotional flavors of arousal like a chef describing curry complex, layered, precise. One such text whispers of a man who could tell your desire level just by how your toe twitched. Historians still argue whether this was practical knowledge or playful exaggeration. But when you're half asleep with a breeze brushing your ankle, it's easy to believe everything. And then there's the real juicy stuff. Let me tell you about a little ashram drama you probably didn't read in your high school textbooks. There's this story found in the Ananga, another ancient manual of love that features a widowed princess who takes refuge in a sage's hermitage. She's grieving, he's detached. Or at least he says he is. Until one evening, during a moon ritual, she catches him watching her with just a little too much mindfulness. She calls him out. He tries the old, "You are Maya, the illusion, sent to test me" routine. She laughs. That night, they don't meditate. They merge, sensually, spiritually, and perhaps politically. Because by dawn, she's not just healed, she's his student in Tantra, and he's suddenly very open to co-ed spiritual advancement. This wasn't scandalous back then. In fact, intimacy in these narratives is often framed as a path to liberation, not a detour. That's a hard concept for modern brains trained on guilt, shame, or clickbait purity. You grew up thinking monks renounced all pleasure. But in ancient Indian cosmology, the universe itself was born from desire, kama. Not kama as in just sex, but kama as the pulse of longing that moves stars and opens lotus flowers. To deny it entirely? That was considered spiritual arrogance. To learn how to dance with it. That, dear listener, was wisdom. Even the gods were doing it, but you will get to their stories later. For now, let this sink in. The idea that sacred texts could instruct you on how to touch someone, not just with your fingers, but with your breath, your gaze, your silence. One obscure passage even suggests that the right compliment, whispered with the right emotional intent, can realign someone's prana or life force. Imagine your hinge date leading with that instead of "wid." But here's the quirky bit no one sees coming. Some of these ancient texts were written collaboratively, like ancient open-source love coding. A line on lip biting might be attributed to one sage, while a footnote on neck nuzzling could have been added 2 centuries later by a monk in exile. The Kama canon wasn't a monolith, it was a living, breathing manuscript network, passed around. Like gossip, revised like recipe scrolls, and treasured like stolen glances across firelit rooms. So, as you recline into this night's adventure, remember, that breath on your neck, that curl in your spine, that dreamy tug behind your eyelids, it all had a script. And in ancient India, they wrote it in verse. You're now crouched in the corner of a smoky royal library, a scroll clutched loosely in your hand, the air heady with sandalwood and something subtler curiosity maybe, or scandal. Before you unfolds the Kama Sutra, that infamous misquoted, wildly misunderstood relic of human desire. Not a sex manual. Not a raunchy listicle of ancient India. It's more like a user's guide to life, only it doesn't separate the mind, body, and spirit like modern to-do lists do. You expect nudity, but what you get is nuanced, detailed instructions on conversation, personal grooming, types of kisses, and yes, the art of seduction, but all framed with the seriousness of a yogic treatise. Vatsyayana, the author, wasn't some scandalized hedonist. He was more like a calm, celibate nerd who just wanted people to stop messing up intimacy. He wrote this during a time of great social transformation, urban growth, shifting class structures, and women who could read. And he took it all in, codified it, and handed back a mirror polished with erotic philosophy. Historians still argue whether the Kama Sutra was ever intended as a bedroom book or a socio-political commentary disguised in lace. You're holding both possibilities in your hands now. Flip a few more palm leaves, and you land on the asanas positions, each one named, metaphorized, and described with the care of a yoga sequence. One is called the twining vine, another, the splitting bamboo. You chuckle, of course. They sound like cocktail names or indie bands. But then you read how each position is suggested not for physical acrobatics, but for emotional compatibility, spiritual rhythm, and energetic harmony. It's not about the angles, it's about intention. Eye contact is mentioned more times than climax. The breath is given more space than the body. You start to realize this book isn't whispering, do this. It's humming, be here. Then, there's the unexpected advice. Lovers should sleep separately sometimes to keep desire alive. A man should study a woman's laughter patterns to know her true mood. People should avoid over-attachment and learn to love without devouring. You blink. That could be a TED Talk, or your therapist. But here it is, in a 2,000-year-old scroll written in Sanskrit, next to an illustration of a couple spooning under a mango tree. The Kama Sutra doesn't promise eternal love. It offers skillful presence. And maybe that's even harder. Let's step into one of its case studies, a courtesan named Vasansena, fictional but inspired by the real women of that era who straddled power and pleasure like seasoned diplomats. She wasn't just a companion. She was a cultural icon, trained in music, poetry, and the politics of seduction. One night, she receives a royal guest who arrives pompous, perfumed, and clearly expecting a performance. Instead, she makes him wait, offers him water but no touch, asks him questions but reveals nothing. The suspense stretches until finally, she recites a verse about longing so precise, so disarming, that he drops his ego like a loose sash. Only then does she approach him. What followed was not a conquest but a conversation of limbs, punctuated by laughter and murmured verse. According to the text, he left humbled. She stayed powerful. The whole scene is a masterclass in sensual pacing, and yes, it's PG-13 with a side of emotional IQ. Here's your quirky tidbit for the night. The Kama Sutra classifies kisses by sound. Yes, sound. A soft one is called the sigh, a louder one, the smack, and the most intense is likened to the crack of thunder in a pre-monsoon sky. Somewhere out there, Two scholars once argued for days over whether the thundering kiss was literal or metaphorical. Their letters are now preserved in archives, written in perfectly polite Sanskrit, debating kisses like cartographers mapping. Storms. Academic thirst. Ladies and gentlemen, you roll onto your side now, heavy-lidded, and the firelight in our imaginary scene flickers as if winking at you. You realize the Kama Sutra doesn't shame desire it, crafts it, guides it, treats it like a sacred language you're expected to speak fluently before you ever claim to love anyone. It's like emotional yoga, the stretching of patience, the flexing of attention, the balance of surrender and strength. And no, it doesn't begin or end in bed. It lives in the way you hand someone a cup of water, the way you let silence stretch, without panic, the way you listen to what they don't say. By the time you close the scroll, you understand why these texts were read not just by lovers, but by kings, monks, merchants, and women with plans. It wasn't about sex. It was about skillful living, where every kiss is a question, every gesture a line of poetry, and every night a new page. You walk barefoot through temple corridors slick with centuries of incense ash and monsoon dust. And the stone underfoot is warm, as if holding on to the memory of ancient bodies. Above you, carvings ripple across the temple wall, stone lovers frozen mid-arch, mid-moan, mid-lifetime. And it hits you. You're standing inside an orgasm carved in granite. Welcome to Khajuraho, or Konark, or any number of medieval temples. Across India, where spiritual architecture didn't separate prayer from pleasure, it built them into the same scaffolding. These temples weren't shy. They didn't ask you to look away. They invited you to look closer. And as you tilt your head to trace the outline of two entwined figures who somehow managed to look both divine and deeply into each other, you begin to understand this wasn't just art. It was instruction, devotion, celebration. And yes, it was deeply, unapologetically erotic. You expect the erotic art to be tucked away in dark corners, but no, it's right on the main towers, greeting the gods above and villagers below. Some figures bend in ways that defy both spine and gravity. Others kiss with a kind of sculpted tenderness that makes your throat tighten. A woman rides her lover while twisting to play a flute. Another lies reclined while attendants fan her post-coital, their faces serene, like this was just part of the ritual. Which it was. Historians still argue whether these carvings served as tantric diagrams, spiritual metaphors, or visual aphrodisiacs for pilgrims. But what's clear is that someone spent decades chiseling joy into stone and called it sacred. You don't get that level of detail from repression. You get it from reverence. One theory says these temples acted like erotic textbooks for villagers who couldn't read Sanskrit. Another suggests they were spiritual shock therapy confronting desire to transcend it. Like those Buddhist monks who meditate on corpses to detach from the illusion of life, these temples made you look sex in the face so you could see past it. But here's a twist. Many of these temples are dedicated to Shiva, the yogi god who dances between creation and destruction. And right on his temple walls, a sculpted couple mid-coitus, their arms locked, eyes closed, limbs fluid like water. Not sinful, not secret, just ... Tonight's story comes from a temple legend, a tale whispered by generations of guides and grandmothers alike. Once, a sculptor was commissioned to carve a lover's panel so beautiful it could awaken the gods. But every time he chiseled a thigh or lip, he found himself haunted by dreams of the woman he sculpted. So vivid, so urgent, he began to lose sleep, appetite, reason. One night, the stone woman stepped from the wall and asked, "Is this what you wanted? To love something you can never hold?" They say he kissed her anyway. And in the morning, he was found smiling, face to stone, his chisel still warm. Quirky detail? That panel's still there, untouched by rain or time, smoother than the rest. Like someone kissed it. Hard. But these weren't just sex scenes. They were cosmological charts, tantric maps. Every curve and clasp had meaning. A woman leaning backward wasn't just being dramatic, she was enacting surrender to Shakti, the divine feminine. A man holding her feet above his shoulders wasn't showing off, he was elevating her energy center. These poses were visual prayers. One particularly bold carving shows a group of women laughing as they spy on a couple mid-act, hands covering mouths in mock modesty. The divine, it seems, had a sense of humor. You pause at a frieze of dancers circling a sensual couple and feel the thrum of movement echo across time. These temples weren't silent sanctuaries. They were once alive with song, drumming, the jingling of anklets and the hum of desire. The priests chanted, the dancers spun, the visitors watched, sometimes prayed, sometimes flirted. It was a multi-sensory ritual. And somewhere between the mantra and the moan, you realize that ancient India didn't exile the body from the divine. It elevated it. The most shocking part? These temples were often commissioned by kings and funded by merchant guilds. Public works of erotic spirituality, built without shame. Compare that to today's confused whisperings around sex ed and censored textbooks, and you'll understand why standing here feels more like time travel therapy. These weren't crude or pornographic. They were exalted, detailed, human, holy, and not one figure on these walls is shamed or hidden. No leaves, no censorship. Just flesh and stone and an unapologetic invitation to feel something. As the temple bells toll in the distance and the stone cools beneath your feet, you leave with one lingering truth carved deep into your sleepy thoughts. Sometimes, the most sacred thing you can do is to touch with full presence. You're peeking through a lattice screen now carved with swans, lotus vines, and just enough space for one sharp eye, and what you see on the other side would melt the gold off a palace ceiling. Picture this: a queen, draped in silk so sheer they might as well be mist, reclines on a bed of rose petals while two maidservants massage her legs with sandalwood oil. But she's not preparing for a festival. She's prepping for a ritual. And not the kind with incense and bells, no. This is a tantric rite, and her body is both the offering and the altar. Welcome to the world of royal women who wielded sexuality like strategy and devotion like perfume. These weren't damsels waiting in tower windows. They were initiates of erotic mysticism, spiritual tacticians who studied desire as a sacred science, and, occasionally, a political weapon. Tantric practice wasn't reserved for wandering yogis with ash on their faces. It made its way into royal chambers where queens, consorts, and even concubines were trained not just in diplomacy and dance, but in the art of awakening Kundalini, the coiled serpent of energy believed to sleep at the base of the spine. And the method of awakening it? Sometimes breathwork, sometimes chants, often deliberate, mindful, slow-burning sex. Imagine learning to breathe through each sensation like a mantra, letting your pulse sync with the universe. No faking, no rushing, just presence. Our featured story tonight is about a real royal, Queen Rudrama Devi of the Kakatiya dynasty. While she's mostly remembered for wearing armor and ruling like a boss, lesser-known legends hint at her fascination with esoteric texts. One tale speaks of her secret lessons with a tantric master lessons held in moonlit gardens where every leaf trembled with anticipation. She practiced the rituals not for pleasure, but for power, believing, as some texts suggest, that spiritual unity through sacred union could expand consciousness, sharpen intuition, and literally boost a ruler's charisma. According to the court rumor mill of the time, her gaze alone could unnerve generals and enchant diplomats. Coincidence? Historians still argue whether she ever took a consort or remained celibate by strategy, but whispers of a chamber with gold-threaded veils and a permanently lit incense altar linger like perfume in the archives. And here's your quirky tidbit. Certain tantric schools taught queens to identify their lover's elemental energy, earth, fire, water, air, or ether, and match the ritual accordingly. A fire lover might be met with cooling sandal paste, a water lover with slow, flickering candlelight. Sex was basically an ancient version of a deeply customized astrology app. Swipe right on ether, but only if your moon is in Scorpio. Tantric rituals weren't always physical either. Some were purely meditative. Queens trained to envision their lover as Shiva, to see his touch as divine energy, and to let the boundaries between ego and body dissolve like sugar in warm milk. One instruction manual even suggests gazing into your partner's eyes without blinking until you see past the person and into the pulsing fabric of the cosmos. Try doing that on a Tinder date without terrifying someone. But don't be fooled into thinking this was just New Age spa night. These rites had rules, sacred boundaries, chants to memorize, abstinences to observe beforehand. And always, the goal was spiritual merging, not emotional dependency. The queen wasn't falling in love. She was becoming godlike, if only for a heartbeat. And sometimes, that heartbeat was all it took to shift fate. Of course, not all royal bedrooms were altars. There were also games, literally. Ancient texts described dice-based foreplay, mirror seduction rituals, and roleplay involving goddesses and demons. The Kama Sutra itself lists bedroom competitions, like who can hold a kiss longest, or who can make the other laugh during intimacy without breaking rhythm. Competitive cuddling, 11th century style. But what separates this from cheap? Novelty is intention. Each act was part of a broader philosophy that treated desire as a current, not a curse. A queen in tantric training was learning to ride that current, not be drowned by it. She could be both devout and desirous, both commanding and caressed. In fact, the text suggests that this balance made her more fit to rule. The woman who knew her own body, her own thresholds, her own breath. She couldn't be manipulated. She couldn't be owned. And so as you withdraw from that lattice screen, heart racing a little, eyes wide, you realize the palace isn't just a seat of power. It's a place of ritual, rhythm, and revelation. And those royal women? They weren't behind the throne. They were the throne. You're lying on a cool stone ledge now, watching the stars blink through a break in the banyan leaves. But your ears are tuned to something far stranger, laughter, soft and melodic, echoing through the dark, followed by the sweet trill of a flute. You turn, and there he is, Krishna, blue-skinned and barefoot, reclining beneath the tree like he owns the moonlight. Around him, the gopas, milkmaids turned mystics, are dancing, spinning in dizzying devotion. Drawn not by duty, but by desire. Welcome to the divine love stories of ancient India, where gods didn't shy away from intimacy. They modeled it, exaggerated it, and mythologized it until the cosmos itself became an erotic playground. And in the heart of it all, passion as prayer, flirtation as offering, seduction as sacred act. You've heard of Krishna as a deity, a flute player, a warrior, but here, he's something else entirely, the divine lover. His flute isn't just an instrument. It's a summons, a call to abandon social norms and run barefoot into moonlit fields of longing. According to the Bhagavata Purana, when Krishna plays his flute, the gopas drop everything literally. They leave children, cows, even marriages behind, drawn by a yearning so profound it collapses all moral scaffolding. And he meets them in the forest, not for war, not for doctrine, but for dance, for touch, for oneness. Historians still argue whether this story was ever meant to be taken literally, or as a metaphor for the soul's ecstatic union with the divine. But when you hear how one gopi swears she feels his breath on her cheek long after he vanishes, or how another describes his eyes as dark oceans of forgetting, it's hard not to feel your pulse slow. This isn't casual storytelling. This is soul alchemy disguised as romance. Tonight's story is about Radha, the eternal consort. Krishna's equal and opposite. But here's the twist. She's married to someone else. Their love is forbidden, impossibly complicated, and yet completely transcendent. One night, during the Rasa Lila, the divine circular dance, Krishna multiplies himself so that each gopi thinks he is dancing only with her. But when Radha walks away, hurt or maybe just testing him, he vanishes from everyone's sight. The dance collapses. Joy evaporates. It's only when he finds her, alone and furious under a flowering tree, that balance is restored. And not with apologies or promises, but with presence. He simply looks at her, and she looks back. No words, just understanding. And in that silence, they merge not just as lovers, but as aspects of the same cosmic longing. It's tender, yes, but it's also wildly sensual. Descriptions of their encounters use metaphors that blur the line between the erotic and the ethereal. Her bangles melt at his touch. His voice turns her bones to water. Their union is less about consummation and more about dissolution ego. Into soul, form into formlessness. Tantra in mythic drag. Here's your quirky tidbit. In certain village rituals, couples reenact the Krishna-Radha story during festivals, complete with mock flirtations, symbolic makeup gestures, and whispered verses. But only the women get to play Krishna. That's right. They carry the flute, they lead the dance, they direct the rhythm. In this reversal, desire becomes empowerment, and tradition becomes subversion, all under the full moon's watchful gaze. And this isn't limited to Krishna. Flip over to Shiva, the dreadlock destroyer, and you find another erotic cosmic duo, him and Parvati. But theirs is a slow burn. After eons of ascetic meditation, Shiva is coaxed back into the world of the senses by Parvati, who embodies patience and persuasion like a seasoned seductress. She doesn't storm his cave, she builds her own. Right next to his, waits, practices her own austerities. And slowly, he notices. When they finally unite, the texts say their lovemaking shook the mountains and spun the galaxies. One passage from the Shiva Purana even claims that time itself paused to watch. But again, it's not just about bodies. It's about equilibrium. Shiva represents stillness. Parvati, motion. Together, they create rhythm. Desire in these stories isn't chaos. It's choreography. You lean back now, the flute music fading, the stars blinking slower, softer. These divine stories weren't warnings. They were invitations to explore your own longing not as weakness but as a compass. To see love not as a transaction but a transformation. And to accept that even gods need to touch, to ache, to tremble. Because if the divine can desire, maybe desire isn't the opposite of sacred. Maybe it is the sacred. You're seated now. In the corner of a perfumed salon, the kind with embroidered cushions tossed like secrets across the marble floor, and walls that remember more sighs than sermons. A woman walks in not veiled, not timid, not here to serve, but to study. She's a courtesan, yes, but not the kind you think. This is the ancient Indian Nagarvadhu, the bride of the city, chosen for her wit, grace, and ability to turn seduction into an art form. She bows not to men but to music, to language, to politics, and tonight to you. Welcome to the world of state-sanctioned sensuality, where courtesans weren't just lovers, but keepers of secrets, healers of egos, and sometimes silent revolutionaries draped in gold thread and jasmine oil. Unlike modern assumptions, these women weren't sidelined or shamed. They were invited into royal courts, into literary circles, even into spiritual debates, and paid better than most ministers. Their education included poetry, classical music, perfumery, legal knowledge, and of course, the Kama Shastra, the broader family of erotic science texts that trained them to read a man faster than he could spell his name. But their most dangerous skill? Listening, deeply, intimately. The kind of listening that cracked open the chest and made kings confess things they wouldn't say to their gods. Tonight's story comes from the court of King Boya, where a courtesan named Vamavati once entertained. Not through dance or touch, but through argument. During a festival, she was asked to perform, but instead requested a debate. The court laughed. She didn't. She challenged the kingdom's top scholars to a contest of metaphors. One by one, they faltered. She described longing as a lamp flickering in monsoon wind, seduction as a river changing course without force, and heartbreak as sandalwood that smells sweeter the more it's ground. By the end, the room wasn't silent because they disapproved it. Was silent because they were spellbound. She didn't just win the debate. She was offered a ministerial post, declined it, sighed. Power is temporary, but influence, that's an art. These women, you realize, were not just consorts. They were confidants. One famous to wife from the Mughal era, Rasika, was known to memorize military formations from pillow talk and pass the intel along coded into verses. Courtesan as spy, lover as strategist. There's even a tale of her hiding a rebel map inside. A song. When asked how she wasn't caught, she said, "No one listens when they think they're being flattered." Historians still argue whether Rasika was a real person or a legend sewn together from several women's lives. But if she didn't exist, someone needed her to. Here's your quirky tidbit. Courtesans had fan clubs, literal followings. Poets wrote odes to them. Merchants left offerings at their doorsteps. Even monks on occasion paused to hear their debates. There's an inscription in a 12th century Jain temple that mentions the wisdom of Amrapali, whose glance silences armies. Imagine having your smirk immortalized in stone because it made generals rethink their battle plans. But don't mistake this for glamour without cost. These women walked tightropes between freedom and judgment. They were elevated but excluded, adored but never fully accepted into the domestic sphere. They lived in the in-between, celebrated by men, envied by women, and misunderstood by history textbooks. Yet somehow, they kept their power intact, not by hiding their sensuality, but by mastering it. Seduction wasn't their identity, it was their toolkit. And with it, they healed egos, softened tyrants, and reminded an empire that pleasure isn't the enemy of intellect. Some were even involved in temple culture, offering their dance and song as devotional acts, devodaces whose love for the deity blurred into personal intimacy. One famous story tells of a temple dancer who refused royal invitations because she was already married to the god. And yet, she wrote verses about divine touch that made even seasoned priests blush. The body to her wasn't a cage or a commodity, it was a lyric. And every movement she made was a form of worship. As you lean back now, surrounded by imagined silk and the distant jingle of ankle bells, you realize something. These women weren't just footnotes. They were chapters, essential ones. They held the emotional intelligence of the court, the rhythm of the city's breath, and the kind of soft power that doesn't get recorded on scrolls, but echoes still in the spaces between the official lines. And maybe, just maybe, seduction is what happens when presence meets precision, and history finally learns to look women in the eye. You're standing at the edge of a dark river now, the kind that winds like a secret through the jungle and across the water. There's a flicker of flame, one single oil lamp burning beside a man who's seated on a rock, naked but for a thread. Across his chest, his eyes closed, breath slow, spine straight as a temple pillar. He hasn't spoken in weeks, hasn't eaten in days. He's here to conquer the self. And yet, somewhere deep behind those eyelids, something stirs. A dream. A memory. A temptation. Tonight, you're meeting the men who tried to outrun desire, only to find it curled up beside them, whispering in Sanskrit. Welcome to the world of ascetics with wet dreams, of holy men haunted not by demons, but by thighs. In the forests and caves of ancient India, renunciation was a status symbol. To reject wealth, pleasure, attachment, that was true power. And the men who did it, the sadhus, the rishis, the wandering sages, they were treated with reverence. People bathed their feet, offered fruits, begged for blessings. But what no one talked about was what happened when the forest got quiet, too quiet. Because here's the truth history tries to sand down. Even saints had libidos. Even the most disciplined ascetics found themselves dreaming of skin, scent, softness. The body, as they say, remembers that one famous story, tucked away in the Mahabharata, tells of the sage Vishwamitra, a spiritual heavyweight, disciplined, fierce, unmoved by temptation. Until one day, the gods, feeling threatened by his growing power, send Menaka, the most exquisite celestial nymph in existence, to distract him. She doesn't arrive with drama. She just appears near his hermitage, bathing in a stream, laughing, softly letting her hair fall over her shoulder like a curtain of moonlight. He hears it, smells the blossoms, peaks, and just like that, boom, years of meditation gone in a heartbeat. They spend the night together, and the next, and the next. He even builds her a house in the forest. Only later does he realize it was all a divine setup. She was a test. He failed or passed, depending on how you read it. Historians still argue whether the tale is a cautionary story or a confession disguised as myth. But the real tension wasn't just external, it was internal. The goal of these renouncers wasn't to kill desire, it was to witness it without attachment. Some texts describe practices where ascetics would deliberately meditate on sensual images, not to indulge, but to sharpen their awareness. Imagine sitting cross-legged for hours, picturing a lover's touch, not moving, not reacting, just breathing. It's like mental tantric training for the soul. Hardcore emotional detox. Here's your quirky tidbit. There's an entire offshoot of yoga philosophy called Laya Yoga that suggests sexual fantasies are not distractions, but doorways to deeper truths. Practitioners were told to visualize acts of pleasure with such clarity that the mind eventually burned through the desire, leaving only stillness. Talk about facing your cravings head on. One manual even advises imagining a beautiful lover turning into light mid-climax. That's one way to meditate, but not every monk succeeded. There's a story about a young renunciate who boasted that he had mastered all temptation. He meditated near a village where a courtesan lived, and one day, she decided to test him. She walked by, barefoot, trailing perfume. He didn't flinch. The next day, she sang near his hut. He didn't move. The third day, she left a flower at his doorstep. He opened his eyes, just for a second, and that was enough. That night, he dreamt of her, the next night too. By the week's end, he had shaved his beard, borrowed a silk robe, and knocked on her door. She opened it, smiled, and said, "So your ego fell before your body did." But here's the twist. These aren't failures in the ancient texts. They're lessons. Proof that desire isn't the villain. The villain is arrogance. And the hero? The one who learns, adapts, and comes back stronger. Some monks even wrote poems about their lapses. One wrote, "I fell for her like Ganga falls from the heavens, not as weakness, but as flow." Vulnerability was woven into enlightenment, not exiled from it. So now, as the fireflies dance above the river, and the lone lamp flickers beside our dream-prone sadhu, you begin to understand that even stillness has a pulse, even silence has echoes. And sometimes, the path to awakening isn't in denying the body, but in learning to listen when it whispers. You're lying flat on your back now, in a room lit only by flickering ghee lamps, the walls painted with spirals and symbols that seem to pulse with every breath you take. The air is thick with sandalwood, and somewhere a soft bell chimes in, a rhythm slower than your heartbeat. Across from you sits a couple still connected, eyes locked as if nothing else in the universe exists. They're not kissing, they're not touching, and yet something is moving between them. Welcome to the world of Tantra, not the quick fix Instagram version, but the ancient, layered, terrifyingly beautiful practice where sex wasn't a goal, but a galaxy. And orgasm wasn't an ending, but a doorway. Tonight, you're not just watching. You're learning how ancient Indian texts taught people to breathe their way into transcendence. One slow, sacred pulse at a time. Forget everything you think you know about Tantra. It's not about candles and scented oils and overpriced weekend workshops in Goa. It's about energy, presence, surrender. In these ancient scrolls, some as old as the 5th century Tantra, is laid out as a cosmic operating system, one where the body is a temple and every sensation is a sacred offering. Unlike mainstream Hindu paths that often prioritized renunciation, Tantra said, stay in the world, touch it, taste it, merge with it. The divine wasn't something out there. It was pulsing inside you, especially when you were trembling, breathless, wide open, and fully alive. Tonight's story comes from one of these esoteric texts, the Vijnana Bhairava Tantra, which describes 112 meditations for realizing the divine, some through silence, some through stillness, and a few through what can only be described as cosmic lovemaking. One passage instructs, at the moment of intense pleasure, be so utterly present that only awareness remains. In that instant, you become Shiva. It's not about technique. It's about attention. About dissolving the ego so fully in the act that only pure being remains. Some practitioners train for years just to be able to hold eye contact without flinching. Because that's where the real friction is, not body to body, but self to self. In one temple tradition, couples were selected for sacred rites where union wasn't just permitted, it was required. Not as entertainment, as ritual, as cosmology in motion. A circle of initiates would chant around them while they merged. Slowly, deliberately, with breath-leading movement, not the other way around. And afterward, they weren't asked, did you finish? But did you disappear? Historians still argue whether these rites were literal, symbolic, or both, but the texts remain maddeningly specific and defiantly mystical. Your quirky tidbit? In one 9th century tantric commentary, a master warned students not to begin sexual practice until they can sit in full lotus position for at least 3 hours without moving. Why? Because if you can't master stillness, your passion will own you. And Tantra wasn't about losing control. It was about stepping so deeply into the storm that you became the calm. One famous anecdote tells of a practitioner who trained in solitude for 12 years, then returned to his partner not with fireworks, but with a single gaze that brought her to tears. He didn't touch her. He breathed with her, matched her pulse, and in that shared rhythm, they both wept, realizing they were not two people in a room, but the universe looking back at itself. Their teacher reportedly smiled and said, finally, you have made love. Tantric texts also map the body like a star chart. Chakras weren't just pretty metaphors, they were described as real, experiential energy nodes. Each one associated with a sound, an element, a feeling. And the goal wasn't to reach climax, it was to guide energy up the spine, like coiling smoke, until it burst through the crown of the head into blissful, wordless awareness. This is where physical union becomes metaphysical combustion. And yes, it's still PG-13, because nothing in Tantra is vulgar, rushed, or careless. It's terrifyingly sacred. As you lie there now, warm and weightless, the symbols on the wall seem to glow. The couple across the room breathes in sync, like waves rolling onto a moonlit shore. And you realize that Tantra was never about sex alone. It was about what happens when sex is no longer separate from prayer. When every inhale is a hymn, when your partner isn't a conquest, but a mirror. And the climax? That's just the echo. The real high is the silence that follows, the kind that holds you like a night sky. And now, as we drift from breath to stillness, let your limbs grow heavy, your thoughts slow like honey in a warm jar. Let the echo of these ancient truths linger, gently in your bones, not to awaken, but to soothe. You are not separate from the sacred. You carry it in your spine, your pulse, your quiet knowing. Let the candlelight dim behind your eyes. Let the soft hum of history fade into sleep. And as your breath softens, remember, even in the quietest moments, you are never alone. The ancient ones are with you, listening, breathing, dreaming. End of script. Sweet dreams.